Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and talk about the iPhone 12 and see how this specific iPhone holds up in 2023, actually. Wow, the time is flying. Now, I'm definitely going to tell you this iPhone is still completely worth it. It's a great iPhone, and this device actually got a few improvements and changes last year as well, which was actually a pretty big thing. I think with something like the, iPhone 12, I think this is still a really good device for sure. I don't really think there's too many complaints about it for the most part in this day and age. I think when it first came out, it had a few things, but one thing I'll definitely tell you, this phone from 2020 is still holding up very well, especially when you look at its, successors. I think the iPhone 13 was a big upgrade, but the iPhone 14 and this iPhone share a lot of different things, and I'm surprised Apple made that iPhone look so similar to this one, in my opinion. Now, if you want to pick up the iPhone 12 or some other iPhones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there, and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside, the iPhone 12 has that 6.1-inch Super Retina XDR OLED display, and it's a pretty good panel. I think it's held up very well from the screen of it all. It is a 60 Hz panel. It's not 120 Hz or anything, but I don't really think that's that big of a problem, and I've definitely had tons of different iPhones that have given me, that haven't really been that great of panels, holding up that well, but I do think this one is still pretty good, and I don't really think this is actually a bad panel at all. And the fact that Apple is still selling it makes me very happy that people can walk into the Apple store, buy an iPhone that's not $1,000, and have a device that's but has a fairly decent display. You still have Face ID on this thing, which is nice. You have flat sides all across this phone, which I think is really cool. Having an iPhone with flat sides kind of makes it feel a little bit more not futuristic, but a little bit more, future resistant in a way, since all iPhones are probably going to have flat sides from now. So I think that's another kind of big asset for this type of phone as well. Now you have a lightning port at the bottom, which is great. And on the back, you have that standard glass back, which, as I mentioned before, I think is a pretty good thing. Having any sort of, feeling like this on any phone is really cool. And I really do like how this device does have that, glass back. I wish it was frosted, but there's really not too much we can do about it in that standpoint either. Now we have that dual camera setup on the back as well, which I think looks really good for the most part. It takes pretty good videos and photos as well, which is cool, and I'll talk about that in a second. We do have this MagSafe charging capability on the back too, which was really nice. And overall, IP certification as well. And it's still a phone that feels and looks very premium. I really don't think this phone has held up horribly throughout the last few years, and I do think it still holds up pretty decently going into its third year. Now, I will say in the camera department, this could be another pretty big asset for this phone as well. So we're getting a 12 megapixel wide-angle lens and a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera on the back, and on the front, we're getting a 12 megapixel wide-angle lens. Now, the one thing I've kind of been talking about the iPhone 12 about for the last few years is the fact that this iPhone holds up very well in the camera department. I do think the 12 to the 13 and 12 to the 14 are pretty big upgrades, but I still think the iPhone 12 holds its own. And from this year, just, looking at this phone in that, hardware itself, I think it holds up a lot in those specific areas. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, for one, you have that ultra-wide sensor, and you have 4K 60 on the front and the back. Those types of resolutions are going to be here for quite a bit of time, and I do think those things in and of itself are, kind of big highlights for this type of phone. It doesn't make everything perfect, but, kind of takes really good photos and videos. You have portrait mode on this phone. You have, a lot of other features like that too, but the newer iPhones do have cinematic mode and stabilization mode and some other, features like that too. So this one isn't sitting at like the top of the top in that area, but I still think it's at a pretty decent area, when it kind of comes down to everything there. So, especially when you look at apps like TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram, this camera utilizes pretty much that specific camera lens, which is really cool. So I think that's another big asset for this type of phone as well. So, in that department, gets a thumbs up for me for sure. Now, some other things, I think the iPhone 12 in that software and longevity standpoint also has some pretty big things to keep in mind here too. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in particular, the iPhone 12, it's still going to be lasting for quite a bit of time. It's not going to be discontinued today or tomorrow. It's still going to be here for quite a bit of time. So I think that's kind of a big asset for this type of phone in that area as well. It has I don't think there's any situation right now where this phone is going to be discontinued. So I think that's probably a really big, thing. But on top of that, this iPhone got a $100 price decrease, the last year from Apple. So I think that's another big thing going for this phone as well. The fact that we have the iPhone 12 at $599 and gives us a little bit more of a, I guess, easier to recommend phone, mostly because you don't have to go and, get it in the used market like an iPhone 12 Pro or 13 Pro or a certified refurbished market. You can just go inside of an Apple Store, Best Buy, or Apple Store online and be able to buy it that way too. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now in the performance segment, this is another pretty big asset for this phone as well, like I mentioned before. It has that Apple A14 Bionic chip inside of it with 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now one thing I will definitely say is, to get it out of the way, the RAM might be the one thing that kind of is a little bit not weird about this phone, but now that we have iPhones like the iPhone 14, the base model that has 6 gigabytes of RAM, but also when you look at phones like the iPhone 15, those ones that have been rumored so far, it's looking like the 15 Pro is going to get 8 gigabytes of RAM, and it's weird because RAM on iPhones, there's like a domino effect. Once iPhones start getting 8 gigs, maybe some of the ones with 4 gigs start feeling slow. I remember for many years when the iPhone 6s came out, 2 gigabytes of RAM felt like more than enough, and shortly after, it started feeling actually super, not slow, but it started feeling noticeably slower or not as much RAM as the other devices. So that was something that kind of stood out to me as well. It's not a deal breaker or anything, but it was one of those things. Now, I digress. With the iPhone 12 in particular, I think this phone still has a lot of power built within it. When I've compared this thing to the iPhone 13, iPhone SE 3, iPhone 14, 14 Pro, even like the Galaxies, the Samsung Galaxy S22, those devices, and so far the iPhone 12 has held up very well in my opinion. It's not a perfect phone by any means, but I do think it's a really good device, and I don't think it's like a phone that I would look at and be disappointed in or whatever. It is a very good phone with a good amount of power, built within it, which I think those are very, very important things to keep in mind. So if you're playing, super heavy intensive games like Genshin Impact or PUBG or Call of Duty Mobile, this type of device is going to be more than enough power, I think, especially when you consider, that those type of games can actually vary in graphics. You can tune down the graphics if you want to. You can increase the graphics if you want to as well. So I think those are some other things to keep in mind as well. So from the performance segment, this phone has held up very, very well in my opinion. Now on top of that, the iPhone 12's battery life has been one of those things that hasn't held up, that well for the most part. This thing has a 2,815 milliamp hour battery, and although it's not a horrible battery life, the battery size was less than what I was expecting, which did kind of make me sad. But the thing about the, iPhone 12 is that it's, fairly optimized. I've done tons of battery tests from this thing and the iPhone 11 and iPhone XR, and, so far the iPhone 12 has held up fairly well, almost as good as the iPhone 13, which is actually surprising. So that hasn't really made too much sense in my opinion, but it's just one of those things that kind of ended up happening. So overall, what I'll definitely tell you is I think the iPhone 12 is still a very, very good phone with just a bunch of power built within it. It may not be perfect, but I do think it's good enough for a majority of people out there. If you're looking for a new phone, I think this is a pretty solid option. Now, if you have all the money in the world, going for the iPhone 14s, like I mentioned before, is the thing that's probably going to make the most amount of sense. I feel like that device has a lot more power and a lot more of a future out of it. But I do think the iPhone 13 is the one that, if you can go ahead and kind of sway your way to an iPhone 13, and that thing has a ton of power built within it, and I do think that's still a solid option for sure. So in terms of that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.